genesis of this story?
We were in the office one day. We just sit around the office, do whatever, talking, which turns into writing at some point. And Joel said, all right, how about suppose there's a folk singer and he gets beat up in the alley outside of Gertie's Folk City in 1961, which was like an odd thought. But you know, that's what we do. You know, when you're writing, all right, here's an odd thought. What about this? Does it go anywhere? I mean, you know, you embroider on each other's ideas and they go somewhere, or don't. And in this case, it did, and that was the.
It didn't actually for a long time. We sort of put it aside and thought, well, where does that go? And I don't know. And then we came back to it at a certain point, certain time later, and started thinking about it some more, and it developed slowly into the movie.
How familiar were you, in a general sense, with the music of the period? Had you listened to it extensively yourselves? And then how much more did you go into it once this kind of took on its own life?
Yeah, you know, familiar in a general sense, not from listening to it during the period itself, because we were small children then. But, you know, when we were kids, we listened to, you know, not so much music from that scene as the music that grew out of that scene. I mean, you know, obviously it's the scene Bob Dylan walked into, so his music harks back to that, and that's kind of how we got into it, by indirection from listening to the music that came out of it. And then, you know, when we knew, specifically, we knew that we wanted to do this movie, when we were writing the script or finishing the script, we did start to listen more purposefully. But it was you know, at that point it was music that we knew more about.
And you know, we made a movie with T-Bone years ago, Oh Brother, where the music in Oh Brother is very much related to this music. This music came from that music. It's different in certain ways from that music, and otherwise it's very similar. In certain ways, you know, it was a revival of that music, but with certain sort of slanted a certain way, and with certain sort of, in the folk tradition, sort of reimagining and reinterpretation, rearrangement, of music, that music that we were doing in Oh Brother. And in certain ways it was just, let's play this, you know, a lot of those people who were on the scene in 1960, 61, late 50s in the village were folklorists. They were interested in discovering, recording, playing, and learning about that music, specifically the music that was in Oh Brother, some of it. So.
I have a question. I love John Goodman in this film. Can you give me a little bit of backstory about his character?
Wow, we're not big on backstory. It's something actors think about sometimes, some actors, and find useful. But wow, it's an interesting question because it exposes a complete vacuum in us.
There were certain things in terms, when we were thinking about it, we thought, well, it would be interesting. We wanted someone who was a musician from the period, but not a folk musician. So we thought, well, let's make him a jazz musician, and there was a lot of interesting things happening in jazz then, and the whole, you know, post-war, that sort of, I was sort of vaguely thinking of him as a guy who came out of that sort of post-war bebop movement that, you know, was very interesting in New York in the 50s and was happening with jazz, but it was so different from what the folk people were doing. And in certain ways, it was, you know, there was a sort of musical sophistication to it that was very different also from what was happening in the folk scene. And as a foil, but you know, who we thought he was, I don't know. We thought, you know, John had certain ideas about it. We had certain ideas about it, but we didn't really care as long as it was sort of some kind of counterpoint, you know.
A lot of the sort of advanced publicity has been saying this is kind of loosely based on Dave Van Ronk, and then Stark was saying his character is kind of loosely based on Tom Paxton. Seems like F. Murray's character might have been loosely based on, I don't know if it would be Albert Grossman or something. I mean, were each of the characters kind of that specific to particular people or no?
No, with the exception of Murray Abraham's character, yeah, that is kind of a reference to Albert Grossman, who did have the club in Chicago, the Gate of Horn, and was a big sort of folk impresario, went on to manage Bob Dylan. But no, the other characters were much, especially the main character, much less specifically. They weren't. You couldn't say it would be wrong to say they're based on anybody. Oscar's character isn't based on Dave Van Ronk, and nobody who knew Van Ronk, I'm sure, would confuse that character for being Dave. We did give him largely Van Ronk's repertoire. Oscar does play mostly Dave Van Ronk songs, and there are very specific things that we cribbed from Van Ronk's memoir, Mayor of McDougal Street. Just very specific things for the character, like the Merchant Marine thing. But that's it. It's really it's a fictional character, and Van Ronk was more of a curmudgeon. He's more like the John Goodman character as a person than he was to Oscar's character. The other, and that sort of goes for everyone else in the movie. There are sort of specific, I don't know, points of reference, but you wouldn't be able to say that any character, except for Murray's part, was based on a real person.
That's also true of Stark's character. I mean, he plays a Tom Paxton song. And Tom Paxton actually was in the Army in that period, and there are certain, just like Oscar's we made him a working class kid from the boroughs like Van Ronk was, that's the same. But again, Stark's character is nothing like Tom Paxton beyond that. He's made up.
Well, you got right on with John. John has always been great. I remember, I think it was Big Lebowski or something, where he had 4 movies, and he came to the radio room when we used to have a lot of people, and he was so nervous. And I just remember, he's from Louisiana. John loves jazz. We started talking about jazz, and he went into his jazz voice right away. And I always remember that. So it's also kind of your good luck charm. You got so many actors that are.
Yeah.
But that's a great thing. Yeah. And I've always liked you guys. No matter what, you can have an Oscar in front of you. You could be walking down the street. You guys have always been the same. And I've always said, if I wanted to be like someone, it's got to be Joe or Ethan Coen. Because they're just so nonchalant. And I've always liked that about you guys. How do you guys stay like that?
How do we stay like that? I don't know. It's, we're just caught on our own hamster wheel, I guess. It is true what you're saying about John, though. He is, he's somebody that we do keep coming back to, because he's, such a interesting actor and such a great actor, but also just because, so for some reason we just, as we're writing things, we often start to sort of hear John's voice in them, This was like a real good example of that, because we would be writing these speeches, and then all of a sudden we go, well, that's obviously going to be played by John. He's kind of the person who can get his...
Yeah, in his soul somehow he's an old jazz cat. It just became obvious it had to be him. He's some kind of hip that's not contemporary hip.
Like, for instance, there's a reference in the movie to Chano Pozo, who was like a big Dizzy Gillespie influence, and John immediately knew what that was about. Just kind of goes by everybody. He kind of totally got that whole thing.
What are you guys listening to these days? When you guys are out just doing nothing, separately, driving, whatever, what do you guys listen to?
Well, as Ethan said recently to someone, we listen to a lot of dead people. Totally dead people.
They gotta be dead. I'm sorry, they gotta be dead.
I know, it's not like we know a lot of contemporary music. I mean, people play, people who are big with, like, my kids age, you know what I mean? I got a 19-year-old, but I don't know a lot of who he listens to. I just don't know that music.
Well, are you guys closet musicians at all?
Ethan is, I'm not.
No, I used to play, but nah.
What did you used to play?
Guitar.
Guitar. Nice.
Do you guys see some of there's kind of a folk revival to some extent going on now with these acts like Mumford and some. Do you see them as sort of the descendant, like picking up the mantle of what these guys are doing?
I think they see themselves as that. Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's very interesting. In fact, when we were starting to do this, my wife said, it's interesting that you're doing this now because there is a lot of, and kind of like I was saying, it was sort of news to me, but she was saying there are a lot of bands up right now that are very directly sort of influenced by that music, and they're acoustic. Marcus, Marcus actually somebody that I did know, and who, for instance, my kid was really into. And Marcus was very instrumental in thinking of the soundtrack along with T-Bone. T-Bone brought him in, and he worked on it from the get-go.
You know, it's funny. Willie Watson, who my kid likes, I didn't realize Buzz was
Yeah.
really into him. Willie is like an encyclopedia of this. I mean, he's very consciously a student of this
Of
stuff.
the music, yeah. And you can tell that with all the stuff it's really it is a continuation of exactly that folk tradition. Like the thing he was playing the other night is a mashup of a lot of different folk songs, you know what I mean? But I
Yeah.
never heard the song before. And it's these people, really young kids now, who are taking that music and just doing the same thing that the folk musicians were doing in the early 60s. Where you listen to this stuff and you run it through your own sensibility, and it changes slightly and it becomes something else, but the songs have a sort of there's a long thread that connects them all.
I read that you guys, a quote, I forgot who said it, but somebody said the movie didn't have much of a plot and you threw the cat in to give it
Yeah.
a little bit of a
Yeah.
narrative structure. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's kind of true. I mean, it was, we did realize at a certain point that this isn't a plot-driven movie. It's sort of a slice-of-life movie, this brief period of time in this one character's life. But sometimes just from a narrative point of view, you are just looking for things that are going to help you structure it and keep it interesting, and also be revealing in some way about other things that are going on. It feels natural to it. It's just a feel thing. And I don't know, that's at some point that idea came into it, and it was, and sometimes those things just prove useful and sometimes they don't, you know? This one stuck around because it was useful.
I listen to dead people too, obviously, so which is a good thing. Talk about having Justin in the movie.
Right.
Oh, Justin's alive, right. Justin, I don't know, he's like kind of obvious to go to for this kind of movie because he's a real musician who's also a real actor, and it's not like there are a lot of them. And, we thought, and we were right, that, offering a real musician to do a kind of music that's totally not what he's associated with commercially would be appealing to him, which in fact it was, and which in fact he does beautifully. He was actually involved in the music more than just in his performances per se. He was kind of around we did a week of pre-records that amounted to sort of rehearsals, and actually he and Marcus were kind of involved in everything. But yeah, Justin's great. I don't know what to say. He's great.